By the time Christopher Young changed his life, it was already too late. He was only 21 when he pulled the trigger, one shot inside a small San Antonio convenience store that ended a man's life and began a 14-year journey toward redemption. On death row, Young transformed from a violent gang member into a mentor for lost youth. But as the clock ticked down to his execution, mercy came too late. The man he killed, Hasmukh Patel, was a husband, a father, and a pillar of his community. And in a twist no one expected, his own son fought to save the life of his father's killer. This is a story about tragedy, forgiveness, and the limits of justice. Stay with me to the end. You won't forget what happened in those final 25 minutes. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe for more true crime stories just like this one. Every city hides stories it doesn't want to tell, stories buried deep within the noise of sirens and the flicker of streetlights. In the heart of San Antonio, Texas, a boy named Christopher Anthony Young was born on September 24, 1983. To most, he was just another child trying to survive the tough streets of Bexar County. But behind his smile and curious eyes was a world of pain waiting to unfold. A story that began with love, loss, and a wound that would never heal. Christopher's childhood was marked by struggle, but it wasn't without moments of innocence. Neighbors remembered a quiet boy who loved to ride his bicycle and play music. He learned to play the violin, the cello, and even the upright bass, instruments that brought him a kind of peace he couldn't find anywhere else. His teachers often said he was bright, imaginative, and capable of great things, but there was always something in his eyes, a sadness, a distance, as though part of him already knew life wouldn't be kind. That harsh truth came crashing down when Christopher was just 8 years old. His father, the man he looked up to, his hero, was murdered during a robbery. One moment, Christopher had a father who taught him how to be strong. The next, he was staring into a future shaped by grief. The loss tore through the family like a storm. His mother, heartbroken and struggling to raise her children alone, worked long hours just to keep the lights on. The little boy who once found joy in music now found anger in silence. The sound of sirens at night reminded him of everything he'd lost. Without a father's guidance, Christopher began to drift. The streets of San Antonio had a way of claiming boys like him, young, restless, and searching for something to fill the emptiness. By the age of 13, he found belonging where so many lost boys do, in the gangs that ruled the neighborhood. The Bloods gave him identity, protection, and respect, things he thought the world had denied him. But that false sense of brotherhood came with a dangerous price. The violin was replaced by a gun, and his music, once filled with hope, turned into the rhythm of survival. By 15, Christopher had dropped out of school. His name began appearing in police reports, small crimes at first, fights, thefts, drugs. Each arrest was another step further from the child his teachers once believed in. Behind every headline and every mugshot was a lost boy, hardened by a life that seemed determined to break him. The people who knew him then say he was torn between two versions of himself, the boy who wanted to do good and the young man who no longer believed he could. Chris was smart, one friend later recalled. He just stopped believing the world had anything good left for him after his dad died. It was a haunting reflection, one that perfectly captured the pain that shaped his path. Every poor decision, every outburst of anger, traced back to that single childhood wound. It wasn't just rebellion, it was heartbreak that never healed. By 18, Christopher Young was known more for his rap sheet than his potential. Yet deep down, he still carried fragments of who he once was, the boy who could make a room go silent with the sound of a cello. But the streets rarely let go of their own, and the next chapter of his life would prove that the past always finds a way to resurface. Because every crime begins long before the act itself. In pain, in loss, and in the moments when a child's innocence is stolen. For Christopher Anthony Young, that moment came when he was 8 years old. And from that day on, every step he took led him closer to a future no one could have imagined. In every neighborhood, there's that one place everyone knows, the corner store that feels more like a second home than a business. For the people living along South Zarzamora Street in San Antonio, that place was Patel's Mini Mart. It wasn't fancy. The walls were worn, the counters a bit scratched, but inside those walls lived warmth. The kind only a man like Hasmukh Patel, or Hash as everyone called him, could create. Hash was born in India, in a small village where hard work wasn't a choice, it was survival. In the late 1970s, he left everything behind, the land he grew up on, his childhood friends, and the comfort of familiarity, all for one dream, a better life in America. When he and his family arrived in Texas, they had little more than determination and faith. But that faith was enough. In 1980, he opened a mini food mart on South Zarzamora Street. He stocked it himself, built the shelves, and learned every customer's name by heart. Locals remember the sound of his voice when you walked in. "Hello, my friend. How are you today?" He treated everyone with kindness, no matter who they were. When someone came in short on cash, Hash would smile, wave a hand, and say, "Pay me next time." He believed in people. That was his biggest strength, and, as fate would later show, his greatest vulnerability. He worked long hours, 7 days a week, dawn to nightfall. His wife often stood beside him behind the counter, their son Mitesh playing quietly in the corner, watching his parents serve the community with a kindness that went beyond business. To them, Patel's mini-mart wasn't just a store. It was a dream come true, a piece of India brought to the heart of Texas. Neighbors would often talk about how Hash helped feed struggling families, offering credit when people couldn't afford groceries. He'd say, "If I can help someone today, maybe tomorrow they'll help someone else." It wasn't just his business ethic, it was his belief in humanity. But the world outside his store was changing. By the early 2000s, crime had crept into the neighborhood. Robberies, drug deals, and violence had become a part of life in South San Antonio. Hash's mini-mart stood as a small beacon of decency amid growing danger. He'd been warned by others, "Be careful, Hash. Don't stay open so late." But he would only smile and say, "If I close early, someone might go hungry." His son, Mitesh Patel, who would later become an advocate for peace and forgiveness, often said his father believed every person had good in them, even those who seemed lost. He trusted people easily, sometimes too easily. That trust was his legacy. And one day, it would be tested in the most tragic way imaginable. On the morning of November 21, 2004, the sun rose like any other day. Hash unlocked his store, greeted his early customers, and joked with a few regulars. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But somewhere else in San Antonio, a young man named Christopher Young, battling addiction and inner demons, was spiraling out of control. Their worlds were about to intersect, two men from completely different lives, bound by a single moment neither could escape. That morning, Hash smiled as he handed out change to a familiar face. His kindness radiated, his trust unbroken. But as the doorbell chimed and another customer entered, fate walked in behind them, quiet, unseen, and unstoppable. In a few short hours, this small neighborhood store, once filled with laughter and kindness, would become the scene of a tragedy that would ripple through two families, two cultures, and two nations. On the morning of November 21, 2004, their lives, and two families, would collide in a way no one could have imagined. The night that changed everything didn't begin as a storm, it began as chaos. The sound of clinking bottles, the murmur of a restless city, and the heavy breathing of a man already too far gone. Christopher Young had been drinking since morning, not 1 or 2 beers, but nearly 2 dozen. Cocaine pulsed through his veins, his body alive with rage and confusion. In his mind, anger and heartbreak had blurred into something uncontrollable. He wasn't just drunk. He was dangerous. Earlier that day, Christopher's downward spiral took a horrific turn. He attacked and sexually assaulted a woman at gunpoint while her children watched in terror. He forced her to drive him across town, wild-eyed, erratic, and unpredictable. Somewhere inside him, the frightened little boy from San Antonio's rough streets was long gone. In his place stood a man consumed by addiction, pain, and violence. As the hours passed, his fury only grew. He was disoriented, paranoid, and armed, a deadly mix. By late afternoon, he stumbled into Patel's mini-food mart on South Zarzamora Street, the same corner store where kindness had always lived behind the counter. But tonight, kindness would meet madness. Inside the store, Hasmukh, Patel was finishing another long day. He greeted his regulars with a smile, offered credit to one man who couldn't pay, and joked about closing early. The surveillance camera caught his final moments, him standing behind the counter, unaware that death had just walked through his door. Christopher slammed the door open, yelling accusations. He claimed Patel had disrespected his girlfriend. Witnesses would later say Patel looked confused, calm, trying to de-escalate. "You must be mistaken, my friend," he said gently. But the rage in Christopher's eyes was beyond reason. He pointed the gun. The customers froze. For a brief second, the world went silent. Then, a flash of light. One shot. Then another. Hasmukh Patel fell behind the counter, his final breath leaving him as the sound of breaking glass filled the store. Customers screamed and ran. Cash fluttered to the floor, mixing with spilled beer and blood. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, but it was already too late. When police arrived, the scene was chaos. The familiar neighborhood store, once filled with laughter, was now sealed off with yellow tape. Behind the counter, the man everyone knew simply as lay motionless. Officers found cash scattered across the floor, the register open, and shell casings glinting under fluorescent lights. The suspect fled but didn't get far. After a short chase, police arrested Christopher Young nearby, his clothes stained, his words slurred, his mind lost between panic and denial. During interrogation, he muttered, "I was drunk. I didn't mean to kill him." But prosecutors saw something different. They saw a man who had already crossed too many lines that day, a man who had attacked, threatened, and finally killed. To them, this wasn't an accident or a drunken mistake. It was murder during a robbery, and they were determined to prove it. News of the killing spread quickly through San Antonio. For the community, it was more than a crime. It was the loss of a man who had stood for everything good in their neighborhood. Customers wept as they placed flowers outside the store. Strangers gathered to light candles in front of Patel's mini-mart, whispering prayers for the kind shopkeeper who had trusted everyone. That night, 2 lives shattered. One ended behind a counter, and the other began its slow descent toward death row. The streets that raised Christopher Young had finally taken him back. This time, not as a lost boy, but as a condemned man. The community mourned a beloved store owner. For the Patels, their father was gone. For Christopher Young, a long road to death row had just begun. The echo of steel doors slamming shut marked the beginning of Christopher Young's new life, a life measured not by years, but by how many days he had left. After his 2006 conviction for capital murder, Christopher was sentenced to die by lethal injection. He was only 22 years old when he entered the Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas, the facility that houses Texas's death row inmates. To many, this was the end of his story. But inside those walls, something unexpected began to happen. At first, Christopher was angry, defiant even. The same pain and resentment that fueled his crime followed him into the cell block. But time has a way of breaking even the hardest spirits. Days turned into months, and silence became his only companion. Somewhere between guilt and grief, the transformation began. He started reading the Bible, letters from volunteers, and messages from strangers who believed even a condemned man could change. In time, Christopher found faith. He joined prayer groups, studied scripture, and started writing to at-risk youth, boys who reminded him of himself. In his letters, he warned them about the path he took, the decisions that destroyed his life, and the pain he caused to others. Guard said he became calm, respectful, even protective of other inmates. He would break up fights before officers arrived, telling them, "We can be better than this." Prison chaplains described him as a man transformed. The same hands that once held a gun now held a Bible. The same voice that once shouted in anger now preached forgiveness. For the first time in years, Christopher wasn't running from his past, he was trying to make peace with it. And then came something no one expected, a connection between 2 men forever bound by tragedy. Mitesh Patel, the son of the man Christopher had killed, reached out to meet him. It was an encounter few could imagine, the victim's son sitting face to face with his father's killer. When Mitesh entered the visitation room, Christopher stood quietly, eyes lowered. But when their eyes met, both men broke into tears. In that moment, it wasn't a murderer and a victim's son sitting across from each other. It was 2 human beings, both scarred, both searching for peace. Over several visits, they spoke about life, loss, and faith. Mitesh saw something in Christopher that few believed possible, remorse that ran deep and real. Later, Mitesh would tell reporters, "Chris wasn't the man who killed my father anymore. I forgave him." Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it gave both families something rare, a moment of grace amid unbearable pain. It was a gesture that stunned the community and ignited a national conversation about justice and mercy. By 2018, as Christopher's execution date approached, Mitesh Patel did something extraordinary. He publicly pleaded for the state of Texas to spare Christopher Young's life. He argued that real change had happened behind those prison walls, that redemption should mean something even for those society had written off. But mercy in Texas is rare. The Board of Pardons and Paroles voted unanimously to deny clemency. The decision sparked outrage from advocates who believed Christopher's case represented more than just one man's fate. His lawyers claimed racial bias in the clemency system, pointing out that no African-American inmate had been granted clemency in Texas for decades. Still, the state stood firm. The execution was scheduled for July 17, 2018. Outside the prison, candlelight vigils began to form. Reporters gathered as activists, pastors, and friends held up signs reading, "Stop Execution." Inside his cell, Christopher remained calm. He spent his final days writing letters, praying, and thanking those who believed in his transformation. He knew his time was running out, but he also knew something profound, that even in death, he had found what he'd been searching for his whole life, peace. As the clock ticked toward 6 p.m., Christopher Young prepared for the end, calm, reflective, and aware that forgiveness had come from a most unexpected place. The sun was setting over Huntsville Unit, the sky painted in gold and crimson, the kind of sunset that almost feels too peaceful for a place built for death. Inside the concrete walls, the air was heavy with silence. Every footstep echoed. Every metal door that opened and shut carried the weight of finality. On the evening of July 17, 2018, Christopher Anthony Young took his final walk, escorted by guards down the narrow corridor that led to the Texas death chamber. At 6:13 p.m., witnesses began to file into the observation room. Some were reporters, some were victims' advocates, and one seat was reserved for a man whose presence spoke louder than any word ever could: Mitesh Patel, the son of the man Christopher had killed 14 years earlier. Beyond the thick glass, Christopher lay strapped to the gurney, staring up at the cold white ceiling, the sound of the warden's voice breaking through the silence. "Do you have any final words?" There was a pause, long, deliberate, the kind that makes everyone in the room hold their breath. Then, Christopher turned his head toward the glass and began to speak. His voice was calm, steady, almost gentle. "I want to make sure the Patel family knows I love them like they love me. Make sure the kids in the world know I'm being executed, and those kids I've been mentoring, keep this fight going." Those words hung in the air. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't regret, it was something else. Maybe peace. Maybe surrender. Or maybe it was the voice of a man who had finally forgiven himself. A prison official nodded. The injection began to flow. Within seconds, Christopher gasped and said softly, "I taste it in my throat." Those would be his last words. Within moments, his body relaxed. The stillness took over. And at 6:38 p.m., the warden pronounced Christopher Anthony Young dead. Unlike the cinematic endings we see in movies, there was no music, no applause, just silence. A silence that stretched beyond the prison walls and into the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. Texas had long abolished its special last meal policy, so Christopher's final meal was unremarkable, the same food served to every other inmate that day. But what made his final moments unforgettable wasn't what he ate or what he wore. It was that, in death, he faced the family of the man he'd once destroyed, and they chose forgiveness instead of hate. Outside the prison, candles flickered in the dusk. Among them stood Mitesh Patel. When asked what he felt as the curtain fell, he said quietly, "I wanted to stop another killing, but I still forgive him." Those words echoed far beyond that night, beyond the prison, beyond the headlines. They became a reminder that forgiveness doesn't erase pain, but it can break the cycle of violence that pain creates. Two men, one behind the counter, one behind bars. Both fathers. Both dreamers. Their lives collided in one moment of unimaginable tragedy, and yet, somehow, through grief and time, they found a strange, shared peace. One through faith, the other through forgiveness. In the end, maybe the story isn't just about crime and punishment. Maybe it's about what it means to forgive, and how even in the darkest places, humanity can still find light. If you were in Mitesh Patel's place, could you have forgiven the man who took everything from you? Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. If this case moved you, please take a moment to like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful true crime stories just like this one. Stories that remind us that behind every tragedy, there are human hearts, choices, and sometimes, redemption.